about the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, we need to have some kind of discussion on that. And I've done that before for students, but I just decided things are changing so quickly, the dynamics are so different than they were even a week ago or 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago. So I thank Russell for inspiring me to...
Don't tell them where we had the conversation.
And Doris Malcolmus, who was originally supposed to be here today, will reschedule Doris's talk for another time, either later on this semester or early next semester. Just before we begin, I wanted to just a few announcements. Next week we're going to have an unusual presentation. We'll have some of the students who are part of the Rhetoric of the Civil Rights Movement class who will be coming here talking about their recent trip down through the South, Selma, Birmingham, and Atlanta, and they'll be talking about that. I also wanted to bring your attention to the fact that all kinds of fellowship deadlines are coming up. Rhodes, Marshall, a whole variety of deadlines are there. In the last email that you got about Paterno Fellows, it noted the upcoming deadlines. Please check that. And secondly, for all of you thesis writers, there are now a whole variety of thesis prizes that are offered, one by the library, one another by Global Studies, and Paterno Fellows itself will be offering prizes this year in the humanities and in social sciences for the first time. So for all of you seniors writing theses, please be thinking of that. Okay, so that'll be just that by way of announcements before we begin. So I wanted to today talk about this very, very complex situation that has arisen in a most unexpected way in Ukraine. Let me first begin for some of you just with a basic map of Ukraine to show where we are. What I wanted to do today is talk a bit about how this all started, what is the Maidan, what happened on the Maidan, and how did that escalate to the point that we're literally talking about a third world war. You see Kiev in the center, that's where the Maidan is. Maidan is a word meaning square, and so the protests began there. They spread throughout a good bit of Ukraine. And now the real hot spot is the Crimean Peninsula, which you see down here, right, in the Black Sea. So you have Turkey just on the other side here. And I would ask you to note two things as we carry on. One, look at this very, very long, extensive border with Russia on the eastern part of Ukraine. And similarly, quite a large shared border on the western side with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, all countries that are now part of the EU. First, we have to begin with a bit of humor, because that's one good thing about studying this part of the world. They have a fantastic sense of humor. And when these uprisings broke out on the Maidan, an anarchist group put up these signs that said, "Country under reconstruction. We apologize for the inconvenience." This is all a wild underestimation. I wanted to just first give you a moment just to see what kind of reconstruction we're talking about. This is the Maidan. This is what it looks like without a protest going on. It becomes an open pedestrian zone on the weekends, and so that's when this photo was taken. There's lots of imperial architecture, Russian imperial architecture from that period, as well as Soviet architecture, and you can see it's fairly aesthetic. There's throwbacks to sort of an earlier era, if you will. Women selling berries and flowers, as well as sort of the onslaught of capitalist advertisement. So the whole issue erupted really quite unexpectedly on November 21st, which is my birthday, interestingly enough, when Viktor Yanukovych decided not to sign what was really an agreement with only to secure an association with the European Union. It was a trade agreement. Ukrainians had anticipated that he would, but he declined to, and that was quite unexpected for a great many Ukrainians. And they decided to, well, I'll get into what their reaction was, but I wanted to first just, part of the problem is that the whole issue about where does Ukraine belong is very often posed in very, very stark terms. You'll see all of these blue countries. They are members of the European Union and members of NATO. On the other side, we have Russia, and the darker red countries like Armenia and Belarus. Those are ones that are now part of the Eurasian Customs Union. And two countries that I'll come back to in just one moment, Georgia and Moldova, you'll notice that they're, according to this map, part of the European Union sphere. In other words, they're not part of the European Union, but they're leaning in that direction. And we're going to come back to those two countries, so please note their location and their importance. But the big wild card in all of this is Ukraine. And I think for a great many Ukrainians, up until recently, they resisted having to choose either Russia or the European Union. But the problem was then when Yanukovych, their president, decided not to sign that agreement, he was then inadvertently choosing Russia for them. So they decided to articulate their response to that. And to quite a stunning extent, huge numbers of people came out onto the street. Here is at night, and you can see tents. People began just living on the streets. There's much one could say about this entire protest. What I want to focus on now are the ways in which it was an unusual protest, right? Demonstrations happen in many parts of the world and many times. But you have here an unexpected, very, very large protest that is occurring in a state that's fairly repressive. So I want to think about what are some of the forms protest takes under such conditions. You'll see throngs and throngs and throngs of people, and I have to say virtually everyone I know was out on the streets. What was interesting about it is you had people then coming from other parts of Ukraine and friends who live in Kiev, either going to work, trying to tend to their children, keeping their own lives going, but always during their free time coming out into the streets. There were all kinds of makeshift tents, and here you have women preparing all kinds of food, because obviously with hundreds of thousands of people out on the square and lots of people literally living there, this strained any kind of possibility to feed them, and so you had all kinds of volunteers feeding them. It also initially had a fairly, I think I would almost even say, carnivalesque atmosphere. Here you have people sort of dressed up as Cossacks, and you have people dancing, singing. So initially, there was a great outpouring, but something like music played a huge role. There was an enormous stage set up, and there were what started off as being musical groups constantly performing. It moved into increasingly political speeches being held, and then it moved into literally like the priests leading the crowd in prayers. So it's going to advance over time, but initially it started off in this very, very almost jovial mood. Once again, here's Yanukovych, lots of posters that are going to make fun of him. This is sort of going back to the old carnivalesque kind of atmosphere. Here's a play on the calling the folks on the Maidan part of Bandera. In other words, trying to slander them as being fascists, harking back to a Second World War II leader. But you had this kind of jovial atmosphere with people of all different ages on the Maidan. And even you had things like this, like buildings lit up in a particular way. The mood changed after that kind of jovial atmosphere. When you have so many people out on the streets, the mood begins to change at times. And this is one of the remaining statues of Lenin that was on the main boulevard leading up to the square. It was the only one. And at a certain moment, then the crowd literally took an axe to poor old Lenin, and he came down. He was just chiseled right on down. And this is a very poor photograph, but I wanted to show you this. So after Lenin was taken down, of course, the pedestal on which he stood was covered in graffiti, and put in place was this golden toilet on top, sort of a statement on their thinking of the past, and in particular the communist past, which they see as intricately connected to Russia. Things took another turn. You had, for quite some time now, right, January 22, we're already 2 months out, and what was really stunning is that you have people out on the streets, and they weren't doing much. They were simply standing there. And this is part of like sort of how one protests under repressive conditions. You have sort of, as I mentioned, this musical stage set up, and it's the impact of thousands and thousands of people who are standing there and refusing to move, refusing to leave. That was meant to be sort of an emphatic rejection of this decision that Yanukovych made. And so for somebody like Yanukovych, this is becoming increasingly problematic. You can imagine that if any city in the United States had throngs of people there, it really created extraordinary gridlock. And so of course it made it difficult even for government officials to get to their offices, let alone anybody else. Over time, of course, the protesters are going to begin to take over some government offices. So on January 22nd, Yanukovych issued a whole variety of orders, including, and I had to put this down, about the criminal activity, new definitions as to what constitutes criminal activity. I mentioned that because I'm involved in a large research project that, so I'm working together with 15 Ukrainians at different, some graduate students, some professors. And so anyone, these laws that were passed at this point, anyone who took money from a foreign organization then was labeled a foreign agent. So interesting, from one day to the next, let's say a group of historians, anthropologists who were involved in this project were foreign agents. And so that put us in this quite terrible quandary. We're 2 years into a 3-year project and suddenly sort of the bottom falls out of things. But I think you can imagine, I mean, how do you think most Ukrainians reacted when after 2 months of standing out on the street, along comes then a whole barrage of laws that restrict contact with the West and begin to, as I said, redefine criminal activity so that these protesters who are now conducting an unauthorized protest, that's then a criminal charge. There's all kinds of restrictions on travel once again. In short, it was sort of a throwback to the worst of the Soviet era. And so, unfortunately, I think had Mr. Yanukovych not done something like this, it's one thing to stand out on the street and even camp out in the street if you're unhappy, but it's really hard for these kinds of popular uprisings to do this months on end. I think had he done nothing, there's a good chance this movement might have had some effects, but it largely would have petered out. One need only look at, let's say, Occupy Wall Street, a whole variety of other groups that after a while, it's hard to keep the momentum going. But one thing for sure that keeps the momentum going is when you begin to pass legislation that's hugely unpopular. So when he passed this legislation, the response was then for even more people to come out on the street. And so with this, everything escalated. It was not just more protesters that were coming out on the street that were angrier still. And this is at the moment when a lot of the speeches became increasingly political versus just purely musical. But also members of the Berkut, or the Special Forces, also came out. Over time, this too really began to escalate. And you have here protesters who are largely unarmed other than things that they have made themselves. They nonetheless did devise effective ways to engage in, I think what, I was going to say combat, that's perhaps too strong, but in some responses. And the big response that they made use of was fire, as you can see here. It's largely tires that they began burning. And so you have tires begin, and other things, literally trash, broken benches, anything that they could find, they began burning. Fire served a purpose in that once you have the Special Forces who are armed and have bulletproof vests and masks, as you saw, fire was a way of keeping a distance between the two. Initially, when the Special Forces were there and the protesters, they were, they were standing up against each other just like I'm standing up against you now. I mean, it was extraordinary in that there would be a line of Special Forces and a line of protesters. And the problem is that it was really easy to just, in the heat of the moment, somebody gives somebody else a push. And the other one pushes back and pushes back. And I saw so many hair-raising YouTube video clips where you think, oh my God, they're pushing each other. Where is this going to go? Where is this going to go? Because, you know, and then one has a stick and, you know, leans over and bonks the other, and the other one has a gun, and is he going to respond that way too? But shockingly, miraculously, they very often were able to, each side, control each other so that any kind of harm was fairly minimalized. But after a while, as the situation began escalating, they realized they couldn't be nose to nose anymore. And that's then where you started having really extensive use of fires that would create not just like a barricade, like flames, but also, obviously, as you can see what it does to, it's hard to see. So in one sense, you have, what do you do when you don't have weapons? Well, you can take apart an old car. You take apart they took apart the porta potties, and they used the doors and the cars, doors from cars and porta potties as shields, and you just begin burning what you can. And the smokier and the uglier it gets, the more you do it. And so you had really then a sharp escalation of confrontation on that level. Protesters began too, you can perhaps see in this photo, these are cobblestone streets. They began taking those apart and throwing rocks. But you know, as we all know, you can really hurt somebody with rocks. Many parts of the city turned into sort of a speaker's corner, if you will, with all kinds of posters and personal pleas being put up. It also became a real patriotic expression. You'll see yellow and blue absolutely everywhere. But over time, this too began to escalate rather than de-escalate. And so then you had protesters then moving beyond fires, but beginning to encircle themselves with these kinds of barricades. And so with this, of course, the center of the city is becoming more and more unruly. And then you can see here they're just gathering whatever they can to build barricades. This is a road leading up to a great number of government buildings. So the government buildings that they've taken, they're looking to hold, and they're looking to keep those special forces out. Here you can see. And you can see there's still lots of people just standing around. And I have as I said, during this whole period into January, I still had almost everybody I knew, when they had free time, they were going there and just standing there, just refusing to leave. That was part of the protest. Here, a friend of mine sent me this. I had to point this out too, a moment of love in the midst of all this. So there was that as well. But, of course, at a certain point, Yanukovych, even his patience were getting quite tested by all of this. And on February 20th, he decided to, I guess he gave the order on the 19th, but on the 20th, that's when he gave the order that this must stop, this square must be cleared, these people must leave, this kinds of barricades, this must go. And at that moment then he sent in, the special forces were authorized to remove these people. And unfortunately, it's at this moment that the violence ratcheted up. And I mentioned earlier those 15 people that I'm working with in Ukraine. And on February 20th, one of them was shot. He was shot in the head. He died instantly, and he was only 29 years old. So that was really a tremendous loss. He was one of about 100 people who died. He was from Lviv. So he had come in from elsewhere. But because he was living on the square, you know, when the order came, it was the middle of the night and there was nowhere to go, and I guess you could say wrong place, wrong time. He's the only person I know up until now who's been killed, but it's a real loss for us, for our project, and I think in general, whenever somebody who's very bright and promising dies in such a senseless way. So, once again, when there can be responses that ratchet things up and responses that quell the tension, and that of course ratcheted things right on up. So you have fortification. Once again, this Iron Maidan. I mean, there all kinds of humor still. More people came out, and you have growing protests now sweeping across Ukraine. So in other words, it's not just isolated in the capital anymore, and especially in western areas, some of the government buildings were there also taken over. So all of this is carrying on, and it even accelerated after the use of violence. You can see this is an area that is really key in that it heads up to a lot of the big government buildings. And you can see, let me just go back and finish here. During this period, as things are really escalating, this is where Yanukovych leaves. I mean, he vanishes at one point, and it's unclear where he is. Almost everyone assumed he had gone to Russia, but there was no confirmation of this. And of course, in his absence, then he was eventually impeached, and another government was put in place. So one of the first things that the new government did that had deleterious effects was to say that in Ukraine, the second language no longer could be recognized. In other words, the state language is Ukrainian, but because so many parts of Ukraine are Russian-speaking, Russian was officially a second language. So in other words, you could study in Russian or in Ukrainian, you could, all government documents were in Russian or in Ukrainian. And at this point, the parliament then decreed it was going to be all Ukrainian. And of course, this then provoked sharp counter demonstrations. Then suddenly came pro-Russian demonstrations in parts of eastern Ukraine. So once again, that was a movement which now retrospectively we can say that escalated things from the other side. The president then vetoed that, so it never became law, but nonetheless that was out there. Crimea really rose to the fore in that this is, it's an incredibly beautiful area. It's very mountainous, it's on the sea, it's fairly tropical. If you watch the Olympics, you could see Sochi was fairly, with the palm trees, very beautiful. Crimea, it's the same. Crimea has enormous sentimental value for certainly Russians, but Ukrainians as well. It was part of Russia until 1954 when Khrushchev transferred it to Ukraine. Usually it's put down as that it was a gift, but in fact it was really for purely administrative purposes. A lot of the Crimea was supplied via Ukraine, and in particular any kind of water and other such key resources there came via Ukraine. So it was a sort of a bureaucratic, it facilitated things administratively, and so it was transferred to Ukraine. And then when the Soviet Union broke up, Crimea then was part of Ukraine suddenly. The Crimea is the key warm water port first for the Soviet Union and then for Russia. So for that reason, there were a lot of military in Crimea, which meant that they were Russian, certainly Russian speaking, and if not Russian by nationality, then also Russian by a linguistic identity, or sort of a Soviet, if you will. In other words, they've lived so many different places that they're sort of by default Russian. In short, it was this area that began to bristle a bit at fears of, once Yanukovych was eliminated, that maybe the new government would be much more westward leaning and much more a version of being Ukrainian that would be dictated by Western Ukraine. So in other words, these kinds of regional differences, fears evolved that a particular region was going to begin to define the whole country. This is a dicey area as well, because if I'm connected. We have the Russian fleet is down in here, and so of course Russia has a vested interest in Crimea and a vested interest in things being quiet there, and it's for this reason that this past weekend then the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, decided that he needed to protect the interests of those living in Crimea. And you'll notice they're alternately referred to as Russians or Russian-speaking populations. Crimea has Russian speakers, Ukrainian, ethnic Ukrainians, and Crimean Tatars, it's an indigenous Muslim group. Those are essentially the three main groups. And things really escalated this past weekend when men in uniform, not necessarily identified initially as military from the Russian Federation, took over the airports in Crimea, took over the ports, and so in essence sealed off the peninsula. And this happened at the same time that, this just sort of situates Crimea within the larger picture, where there were military exercises along the eastern border. And one of the reasons why moving in on Crimea alarmed everyone so much is precisely the same rationale could be used for moving in much of eastern Ukraine. But as you can see, it's a small region, but it's a small region that suggests a far larger region could stand behind it. One of the other reasons why that move that Putin made towards Crimea really concerned everyone is because of the situation in Moldova. If you remember that small province I showed you earlier, it's a very, very teeny little country. It had been part of Romania and it was annexed to the Soviet Union during World War II. But that area too, because it was annexed, had a great deal of Russian speakers or Russians or whatever. Russian speakers, I think, is really the appropriate characterization, who lived there. And in an effort to protect them, this area the Transnistrian region is now a Russian protectorate for all intents and purposes. So in other words, that's an encroachment, if you will, of another sovereign state. It's not the only instance. Things became even of greater concern after the military maneuvers in Georgia. Georgia is a very small little country here, but there are two breakaway provinces that once again have a significant number of Russians living there. And under the guise of protecting Russians, a war broke out, which was horrific, because these are all countries that are economically impoverished and they don't need to be funding military activity. And they remain, this is now really, for all intents and purposes, an official border for those two regions. So given those two examples, if you will, the fear was that the movement in Crimea, taking Crimea, could really go up to and include eastern Ukraine. See the city of Kharkiv there, the area that is feared to break away would be this whole southern flank here. I mean, if you were Vladimir Putin, you might be tempted too, because it's a densely populated, highly industrial, it's the economic sort of engine of the country. There would be lots in the spoils. The only problem is that would really likely create really radically accelerate tensions. Just briefly in closing, for what's at stake for everyone, Europe is enormously concerned about this, largely because about a quarter of their energy sources come via Russian gas and oil supplies that run through Ukraine. So in other words, they're sort of, they don't know which side to take, right? They need Russian energy supplies, but it comes via Ukraine. And just to Timoshenko, Yulia Timoshenko is the woman with the braid, if you've seen her on TV. She, for example, is referred to as the gas princess. She made her fortune by having the brilliant idea just poking holes in all those pipes, scooping that gas and selling it. That's essentially where her initial fortune came from. So there's extensive gas lines. So this is sort of explains the divided opinions in Europe about what kinds of responses, both initially to the Ukrainian crisis. They didn't want to irritate Russia, and they still don't. And that's why some European countries are reticent to embark upon sanctions. And also, there's the US side. I mean, there's some talk about, is this a new Cold War? I don't think it is, but there's no doubt that it's an enormously tense situation. I mean, I still have those friends that I have there, and people that I know that I'm working on this research project with say that they wake up during the night and dial up the internet to sort of see what's going on during the 2 hours I just slept. So it still remains a very, very tense situation. So perhaps I wanted to end there. I want to give enough time if people have questions or comments, or to actually sort of talk about this a little bit more, because it's a very, it's a tough moment, and I think there's still a lot that's unclear and unspoken. Yeah.
Where's the nearest U.S. naval base in the Black Sea?
Gosh,
no, that's what I'm suggesting.
I don't even know if the U.S. has a naval base in the Black Sea. I know that.
I'm curious as to if it would turn really nasty, how quick would the U.S.?
Well, there's.
The latest Ukrainian news said that American carriers and 3 submarines are on their way to the
Right.
territory, but it's just been used.
Yeah, I've heard that as well, that they're on their way, and that's precisely because there's no base, there's no naval base there. There are huge, by the way, U.S. bases in Central Asia, obviously, because of the war in Afghanistan. But you know, we're hoping we're not even like going that. Yeah.
I heard of, like, especially in Crimea, a lot of the pro-Russian protests going on. And from what I understand, a lot of the people themselves, the Ukrainian people, are actually lowering the Ukrainian flag and raising the Russian colors on a lot of administration buildings. Is that going on as far up as Kharkov as well? Or is that primarily only in Crimea that that's happening?
No, it's happened in some eastern cities as well, where they're, this is the problem. Once you embark on this path, in other words, so you have had some people raising a Russian flag, pro-Russian demonstrations in a city like Kharkiv, which then triggers a counter demonstration. And this is where you take a population that was otherwise living very fine, happily, cooperatively together, and you begin to balkanize it and polarize it. There has been that to a degree. I should also say that one other, this is even back on the Maidan, one of the other tactics that was used, which strikes me as brilliant, but in a Machiavellian kind of way. If you think about on the Maidan, those that wanted to discredit the protest very often sent in somebody to carry or espouse a fascist, Nazi, hugely xenophobic, hugely hyper-nationalistic type of slogans. And that was, and when you think about it, that's a very, very expeditious way to discredit the protesters. And the problem is, you know, when you start talking about Russians and Ukrainians, I mean, it's very, very difficult physically, or linguistically, or any other which way to delineate who is who. So there was a word that has now been coined to Titushkin to talk about those that come in or are hired to protest for one side or another. So in other words, this is where, once again, a lot of the confusion, but a lot of the stress arises. Those people that are raising Russian flags, are they locals that are doing it? Or are they somebody who's been hired to do that?
Actually, talking about Kharkov, the person who put the Russian flag there is a person from Moscow, a Russian person from Moscow. He's on Facebook as, I don't remember his name, Nikki somebody, but it's a nickname, I'm sure, but he is the citizen of Russia. And actually, lately, there are, like, even today, 700 Russians were stopped at the Ukrainian border. Those people who are trying to make a
Come
mess
in.
the eastern part of Ukraine.
One of my good friends who lives downtown in the center of Kiev, so at one point I said to her, how has everything been? And at one point she said, oh, well, no, we did have problems. We had fires right in front of our building last night. And I said, what happened? She said, well, there were a group of pro-government, pro-Yanukovych demonstrators, and it seemed nobody paid them. So they got mad, and they decided to respond. So they began burning things themselves. So you realize it's really difficult to know who is who, but that was an instance where they were paid to protest. How would you know that? You only know that except that they didn't get paid and they got mad, and then they created their own havoc as well.
And actually, in eastern Ukraine, it's very easy to tell who is a Russian, from Russia people, and who are Russian Ukrainian people who speak Ukrainian, because there's a very, very distinct accent. So it's very easy to tell. But even there are many cars from Russia with the Russian plates are around those hotspots in Kharkov, in Donetsk. Now, currently at the moment, pro-Russian people in Donetsk are fighting for the city hall and also the finance казначейство, treasures. Yeah, for some reason they decided to also get treasure hall or whatever it's called.
This is where it's really hard. It's really hard to know all of these kinds of reports. But there's reports that Russians are coming in, and it's just hard to know. It's just really hard to know who's doing what.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that I think is really clear is that the Maidan, that was really a genuine outpouring of people of all stripes coming out, for sure. Yeah, and then we'll come back to you. Yes?
It seems like they're really destroying the place. Like they're tearing up the roads even.
Yeah.
Is there concern over how they're going to rebuild all of that?
Well, yeah, the Maidan, the center is really torn apart. You saw that, and
It was
when...
really nice beforehand.
It was really lovely beforehand. The thing is, it's the center that really got torn up. It really got torn up. You're exactly right. But it was very contained. That was also something that really stunned me, is how those barricades just made a little area there. I was constantly asking friends, are you thinking of leaving? Do you have? What are you going to do if it gets bad? Because these things can change like that. Nobody had any plans to leave. And what's more, people would wake up. They'd go to their classes. They would do their homework. They would go to work. The oddity of the normalcy in a highly abnormal situation was also quite striking. But that also suggests to me that although it was really horrible in center, most of the rest of the city was entirely functioning.
say something about the internal reaction in Russia? How mass media react, how
Oh,
people
yeah.
react, yeah.
This is, that's, I never used Facebook before, but now I'm a junkie, a super junkie. And that's because it's both interesting to see so much of this conflict is fought on Facebook, in the mass media, and the mass media in part empowers something like Facebook and empowers everybody's out there with cameras and photographing everything. There's a particular take that is coming across in the Russian media that, well, I guess Angela Merkel said it best when she said Putin has lost touch with reality. I mean, it's very, in some ways, I mean, it was very easy to, looking at those pictures of things on fire, as you saw, I mean, they're horrible pictures. So in other words, if you showed just that, you could think what you did, that the whole place is in flames and that the roads are being torn apart. And of course, there were some people, I mean, there's a right-wing party, Svoboda, that to my mind is quite unsavory. There's the Pravy Sector. This is another group that has very, very militantly xenophobic types of agendas. They're awful, and they're there, it's true. But if you just show them, one could think that, oh my God, hundreds of thousands of people are out in support of them, or they're in cahoots with them. Or, you know, in other words, it depends on what you focus on. And so on one level, I think once again, you can imagine from Putin's perspective, it's in his interest to discredit this as a bunch of hooligans that are destroying the city. They're rabid, revenge-seeking nationalists that want to make all of these Russians forget Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and speak Ukrainian. So to the extent that you have a slant coming on the Russian side, which of course, those folks are really experts at reading slanted news, and they too have access to all kinds of other sources. I was really stunned how after the movement into Crimea, how demonstrations sprung up in most Russian cities against that. So I think there's the Russian incursion into Crimea and the building up of troops and the like. Nothing compared to what happened in Ukraine. That's absolutely true. You don't have.
It was in support of it, I guess, unfortunately.
Well, there's that too, but there's some against. There was some against.
Carefully, yeah, but
Those demonstrations against maybe like 100 or 200 people.
That's true.
At
It's
the
not.
time in a city like Moscow with 10 million population, so it's zero. On Maidan, it was a huge proportion of the city
Huge.
population who were
Huge.
always there, like up to 1/3 of the city population. Were
And lots of people
Maidan.
came in from the regions, yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Russian media, official media like
Yeah.
television, succeeded in persuading most of the population that actually Russians are suffering, and
Right.
there are hundreds of thousands of refugees where while there are none.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a direct lie.
Yes, it is. There's all kinds of
That's
direct lies. I mean, of course, even Putin said right away,
There is no
There are no Russian
military.
troops.
there's no Russian military. I mean, yeah, so there's no shortage of utter bald-faced lies. I mean, just sheer fabrication, that's for sure. But so interestingly, though, that on the Ukrainian side, so in this day and age, right, you just create websites. You just,
Yeah.
I mean, every
And we
time.
have TV Rain, that's the only TV that gives some real news.
Right. Whereas in Ukraine, for example, what they also did on the Maidan, and what they're now doing again in Crimea, is they set up television cameras right on. Oh, you think they're fascist, terrorist hooligans that are destroying the city? Well, here they are, and you see people, standing there. I mean, there was live television coverage all the time from the square. So in other words, saying, don't trust the Russian media or whoever, look for yourself. See, granted, that too is, I mean, it's an edited view, there's no question about it, but it's less edited. So it bred that kind of coverage on the Ukrainian side. Yeah.
As of right now, I know closer, not to the beginning, but once Yanukovych was impeached, Vladimir Putin and most of, I believe it was the Senate in Russia, refused to recognize
Right.
the government as legitimate.
Right.
Um,
Right. They maintain it's a coup, and he was ousted. And
Has that changed since?
No, I haven't checked the news in the past 15 minutes, but but no, I don't think so. No, so they don't recognize the government as legitimate in Ukraine.
Right.
But
Right.
they don't support directly Yanukovych either, I guess.
Yeah, the problem is Yanukovych is he's an embarrassment. I mean, they're very, Putin can barely hide his disdain for, initially when this broke out at one point, I don't know, had the sniffles or something. I mean, he was claimed he was sick. Nobody calls in sick when you've got a demonstration like this. But anyway, so he was sick for a few days, and then afterwards, he vanishes. Nobody knows where he is.
Yanukovych gave his news conference in a shopping mall in Rostov, not
Right.
in any kind of official Russian, so that tells you something, so the status that Putin gives him.
Right.
But the Russian representative in the session of the,
Security Council.
Yeah.
he read the letter or the request from the so-called president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who actually asked Putin to put Russian troops into Ukraine.
Yes.
Because of the mass in Ukraine.
Right.
So I guess, and this is the official representative of the Russian government at such a higher stage read that request.
Right, so it's almost a surreal situation.
Yeah, so it looks like that and Putin yesterday at his press conference said that he recognizes Yanukovych as the president
Right.
of
Yeah.
Ukraine currently.
Right.
So,
He's among the few who does, but he does.
well, it doesn't matter, he's strong. And everybody's scared. I mean, Europe and the US, everybody's scared. Putin will do whatever he wants.
But it's hard to imagine that Putin would try to reinstate Yanukovych in any kind of
Oh, no, no,
I
no.
will not be even surprised if he does it.
No,
So
then-
that
Some
Yanukovych wasn't
pretense.
tough enough, it was all
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
fault.
Mhm.
Russell, I think Russell has a question.
The big picture question I had in my mind before this even happened when I was there last year is, can this country even hold together? I kept asking that question of people. Of course, not to worry, but, I volunteered to be an international election observer for the parliamentary elections. It was October 2012. And we observed in this the vote count in this one little polling place in a little town between Lviv and the Polish border. And Yanukovych's party, the Party of Regions, got virtually no votes in that part of the country. And it was very funny because the woman who was counting off the votes, it was like 4 o'clock in the morning, everybody's exhausted, and she's doing in this sing-song voice, who's getting the votes. And Svoboda, Batishchina, Svoboda, Svoboda. So by the time it was over, and what was alarming to me was, Svoboda got like 30-something% of the vote in Lviv, and in Byers, which was way more than it got anywhere else in the country.
Right.
And so electorally, the split is so pronounced.
Yeah, but look at this country. We have red and blue states.
Yeah,
It's pretty pronounced too, though, isn't it?
but they're kind of scattered around.
They're not as regionally concentrated. That's true. But there's a split. I mean, some people say, for example, that it's practically impossible for a Republican to get elected in the Northeast, for example. I don't in any way deny that there are these sharp splits and that they play out electorally, and that they have now really since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And arguably, they're playing out in more and more shrill terms, to the point that you get a president like Yanukovych, who, by the way, is a 2-time convicted felon, but he's got the right connections. I mean, he's sort of somebody who was really entirely unacceptable in the West gets elected precisely because he's entirely unacceptable to them. It's a way of rebalancing the power, if you will. And it sort of breathes. This is why Svoboda gets elected. Right? I mean, these guys have,
Yeah, all these people would say, oh, it's just a protest vote.
Right.
And I said, yeah, but what about the xenophobia and the anti-Semitism? Oh, they won't get any power anyway. But meanwhile, they wound up with 10% of the vote or something, or 12% compared to 1% in the previous election.
The problem is, there is, to a degree, this kind of protest vote that kicks in, I think, on both sides. And that's, I think, sadly, that's when the situation escalates, right? There's a greater and greater protest, and and the protest takes more and more radical forms. So perhaps, okay, Alex, now go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, wasn't there an election that was rigged?
Well, yeah, of
was it
course.
rigged or something?
Yes, what sparked the last revolution in 2004 was when, for example, in Donetsk, where Yanukovych is from, they had about 104% voter turnout there. And that was when, in 2004, when once again a similar situation, yeah, the dead people are voting and the like, you know, where you have a candidate, once again, Yushchenko, who's got an American wife. I mean, he was seen as very pro-Western. He was handsomely elected by the Western part of the country, and not so much from the East. And so that was quite to be foreseen. And so he was the one who was, he was poisoned. I mean, he was this incredibly handsome man, and now his face is all completely scarred. But there were charges that leading up to that election, that there was so much corruption there. And that's why people like Russell became election monitors. So that preceded this. So in other words, this is not the first enormous popular uprising. But sadly, that popular uprising was unsuccessful, and that's why we're having another. Speaking of having another, we are going to have another talk on this crisis right after spring break, so stay tuned. All right. And I will thank everybody for coming. It was nice to see you here, and thanks for your attention to this issue.